Tonight, we step back in time, not to a battlefield, nor to a triumphal parade, but to a quiet tower room, long abandoned, where the stones remember everything. The hour is late, the moon hangs low above the Thames, its pale light floating like a ghost across the water. In the distance, bells toll from old cathedral towers, the sound muffled by fog and age, and behind thick stone walls, the Tower of London rests in uneasy sleep. Tonight, we speak of a child, a boy dressed in velvet, crowned before his time, hidden from the world behind heavy doors and whispers. They called him Edward, the fifth of that name. But to history, he is remembered not for what he did, but for how he disappeared. He was not meant to be forgotten. A prince born in spring, his reign, if it can be called that, was quiet, sudden, and unfinished. There were no grand speeches, no battles in his name, only silence, deep, echoing silence. Some say he was taken, some say he was hidden, others believe he was slowly unmade by sorrow or by something older, stranger, darker than sorrow. We do not know, and so we dream. We let the candles flicker low, we feel the chill beneath the stone, and we return to a palace without laughter, to a crown without a kingdom, and to a prince whose voice has been lost to time. Let your breathing slow, let the night go still, let the past wash over you like a fog rolling in from the sea. For Edward Fife is waiting, in the hush of history, in the hollows of the tower, in the pages that were never finished. Tonight, we remember the boy king, who vanished before the story could be told. The year was 1483. England, in those days, was a realm of shifting shadows. The Wars of the Roses had left the soil heavy with memory, and the air seemed always on the verge of remembering something tragic. The people walked more slowly then. Or perhaps time simply moved differently, in the hush of those cobbled lanes and moss-covered keeps. It was a land of rivers and mists. The Thames flowed not with haste, but with quiet dignity, winding its way past the towers and walls of London like a silver ribbon, unraveling in silence. On still mornings, fishermen said they could hear church bells ringing from beneath its waters, as if the river remembered the cities it had drowned. In the north, forests stretched like sleeping giants. Oaks and yews and ancient ash trees loomed over tangled roots, where deer paused in the half-light and birds called out only in soft, cautious notes. The green canopy held whispers, of kings and outlaws, of forgotten battles, and of children who wandered in but never came out. The castles, too, bore the weight of memory. Their walls were thick, not only with stone, but with silence. Candles flickered in narrow windows. Ivy curled up through cracks in the stone, as if the earth itself sought to reclaim what had once belonged to her. Towers stood like sentinels, watching over villages where people lived quiet lives, farming, praying, waiting. And in the heart of it all stood London. Not yet the roaring, smoke-filled city it would one day become. No, in Edward's time, London breathed more gently. Horse carts rattled over wet stones. Vendors called softly from beneath timbered awnings. The fog rolled in each morning and never fully lifted, hanging between the alleyways like a curtain drawn over some great stage. High above the murmuring streets loomed the Tower of London. It was not merely a fortress. It was a keeper of things, of secrets, of crowns, of ghosts. Its walls, pale with age and damp with the breath of centuries, seemed to press inward with the weight of all that had happened there. Its chapel was cool and dark, its corridors narrow and winding. Inside, time slowed. Voices dropped. Torches hissed quietly along the stone. Seasons passed, but always felt the same inside those walls. In spring, flowers bloomed in the outer gardens, but never near the inner court. In summer, the heat barely touched the thick stone. In autumn, leaves drifted across the moat like small golden ships, and in winter, the entire tower seemed to sigh beneath the weight of the snow. It was in this world that Edward was born, a world still weary from war, a kingdom where loyalty shifted like sand, a palace that could shelter or swallow a king. The people spoke his name softly. Edward, son of Edward IV, brother to Richard, a boy of royal blood, apwrapped in velvet, led by hands too rough to hold something so fragile. He would never sit upon a true throne. He would never ride through cheering crowds. But for a time, a short, flickering time, he was king in name. The land itself perhaps sensed the uncertainty. The trees grew more still, the bells rang slower, the rain fell more gently, as if mourning something not yet gone. And behind the gates of the tower, the boy waited. Edward was born on a cold, gray April day in the year 1470, not in London, but in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, where his mother Elizabeth Woodville had taken refuge from the storm of war. Even his birth was wrapped in a hush, hidden behind thick stone walls and cloistered shadows. The midwives spoke little as he was swaddled in fine cloth, his cries no louder than a whisper echoing in the vaulted chamber. Outside, the rain tapped gently at the windows as if the sky itself had paused to listen. As a child, Edward was gentle, pale of face, with eyes that always seemed to be looking somewhere just beyond the room. He did not rush or shout as some boys did. He moved with a quiet grace, his footsteps soft even across polished floors. Servants said he had the hands of a musician, though no one ever heard him play. He often wandered the halls alone, his small fingers tracing the grooves in the stone as if searching for something ancient hidden in the walls. He asked strange questions about stars, about silence, about why some portraits blinked when no one was looking. He loved books, old ones especially. Those with stiff pages and faded ink, their edges browned like leaves in late October. He would sit by the window for hours, reading aloud to no one at all. Sometimes he whispered. Sometimes he simply turned the pages in silence, staring at the empty margins as if they held some secret only he could see. At night, he was uneasy. Though his bed was warm and his chamber well guarded, he often awoke in the small hours and padded barefoot to the hearth. He would sit curled in a velvet robe, watching the fire dwindle to embers, the glow painting flickering shadows on the stone walls. His nurses said he spoke in his sleep, murmured things, asked for people who weren't there. Sometimes he laughed, other times he wept. No one could say for sure what troubled him, but the older servants, the ones who had lived through 3 kings and countless campaigns, would glance at one another and lower their eyes. They had seen this before. The quiet ones, the dreamy ones, the ones who listened to things no one else could hear. His younger brother, Richard, was livelier, more grounded, more curious in the ordinary ways of boys. The two played together often, but Edward always seemed distant, as though half of him remained behind a curtain no one else could pull aside. Once, a court painter was summoned to sketch the princes. Edward sat perfectly still, staring just to the left of the canvas. When asked what he was looking at, he said only, "The lady in the veil, she's waiting." The painter saw nothing, but he worked faster after that. As he grew, Edward was dressed in finer robes, taught the language of kings, trained in diplomacy and scripture and statecraft, but he remained quiet, like a poem no one had finished writing, like a song hummed too softly to hear. And when his father died, suddenly like a candle snuffed by a wind that no one saw, Edward did not cry. He simply stared out the window at the gray sky and whispered, "It's begun." What he meant, no one could say. But his nurse made the sign of the cross, and the chambermaid would not sleep in that room again. In the days that followed his father's death, Edward's world became a corridor of endless rituals. He rose each morning before the sun, even though no one required it of him. His attendants would find him already dressed, cloaked in soft wool trimmed with gold thread, standing by the window with one hand resting lightly on the glass, watching the mist creep across the Thames. He never spoke during these moments. Not until the bell in the chapel tower rang, and even then, his words came as faint as the chime itself. The mornings followed a gentle, unchanging rhythm. Warm water was brought in brass bowls. Lavender was burned to clear the air. He took his breakfast alone. Oat bread with honey, watered wine, a sliver of cheese wrapped in fig leaves. He ate slowly, and always in silence. Afterward came lessons. Latin, history, the names of lords and saints and ancient kings carved into dusty scrolls. But Edward would often drift during instruction. His eyes would lose focus, not in boredom, but in contemplation. Once, a tutor asked what he was thinking. Edward replied, "If I were a tapestry, which wall would they hang me on?" In the afternoons, he walked. Not in gardens, but along the covered galleries and shaded cloisters. He moved like a shadow beneath vaulted ceilings, his steps measured and light. He rarely looked straight ahead, preferring instead to glance at the candlelight flickering on the stone walls, watching how the shadows danced like ghostly memories. He had peculiar rituals. He would never pass beneath an archway unless he stepped with his right foot first. He avoided looking into mirrors unless the room was empty and no one was watching. He wore a small pendant beneath his tunic, shaped like a crescent moon. No one ever saw him remove it. He refused music. Even when minstrels came to court, he would excuse himself, slipping away into the deeper corners of the tower. Once he was found seated in an empty chapel, tracing circles on the floor with the edge of his sleeve. "Music is a mirror," he said, "and I already see too much." At twilight, he would light candles himself. always 3 at a time. Never more, never less. The servants were forbidden to do it for him. He said it helped him remember things that hadn't happened yet. He kept his chambers dark. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn at all times, even on the brightest days. Dust gathered on the windowsills, on the edge of the old wooden desk, and in the corners of the carved bedposts, but he never asked that it be cleaned. "Let it lie," he would whisper, "it belongs here." He read in the evenings, often by himself, sometimes aloud. He liked reading stories of old kings, especially the ones who had gone mad, or who vanished, or who were betrayed by those they trusted most. He would read by candlelight until the flame burned low, and then sit in the dark with the book open in his lap, unmoving, eyes half closed as though waiting for the words to finish themselves. On the rare occasion when guests were allowed into his presence, Edward would listen more than speak. He would nod politely, answer in clipped but kind phrases, and always ask just one question at the end: "Do you remember your dreams?" If they said yes, he would smile and offer a nod. If they said no, he would look away, and the visit would be brief. When sleep came, it did not come easily. He disliked his bed, though it was made of the finest oak and carved with stars. He would pace before it for long stretches, staring at the mattress as if it might vanish when he turned his back. Eventually, he would lie down fully dressed and pull the covers up only to his chest. He said it was easier not to dream if one slept lightly. The guards outside his chamber learned not to speak, not even in whispers. He had asked them once with grave seriousness if their voices could be heard beneath the floorboards. Sometimes, late at night, the nursemaid would hear his voice from within the chamber, not speaking but reciting. Lists of names, ancient prayers, long-forgotten bits of poetry, and then silence again, just silence, and the faint sound of wind through the slats, or the tap of a moth's wings against the glass. Each day was the same, and yet not. Each hour shaped like the one before, but slightly more fragile, as though time itself were wearing thin, as though Edward was slowly receding, not from life, but from the world's attention, like ink fading on old parchment. Those who saw him often said he looked older than his years, but others said he did not look old. He simply looked like someone who had been waiting too long for something he could not name. In the final weeks before his name was whispered no more, the dreams began to change. Edward had always been a restless sleeper. His nurses knew that well. He murmured at night, turned with small sighs, sometimes sat upright with eyes open, but unseeing. But now, the dreams clung to him like cobwebs in daylight. He spoke of them softly, almost apologetically, as if the visions had wandered in from someone else's mind and taken root in his. He dreamed of a staircase that never ended, of a bell that tolled without sound, of a silver crown left in a cradle of black feathers. Each dream more faded than the last, and each one he remembered perfectly. One morning, he told a scribe, "There is a door in my dreams, but it is always locked, yet the handle is warm." Birds, too, began to behave strangely. Once, pigeons filled the towers of the White Tower. They cooed and fluttered and made the morning feel, if not joyful, at least alive. But now they circled in odd patterns, in wide spirals, tighter each time, as if tracing something only they could see. And then, one by one, they left. No one saw them go, but the sky was emptier. A raven perched on the weather vane above the tower chapel and stayed there for 6 days. It did not caw, did not move, did not blink. The guards joked at first, called it the prince's pet. But on the 7th day, it vanished, and the guards fell silent. Clocks in the royal chambers began to stutter. Not stop, not break, just stutter. The chimes would ring 13 times instead of 12. The hour hands would spin twice, then pause. Once, the small traveling clock on Edward's writing desk began ticking backwards. No one mentioned it. No one touched it. It was later found beneath his pillow, wrapped in cloth, unmoving. And then came the poems, small scrolls left outside Edward's door, not by any court poet or tutor. No one knew who penned them. They were written in soft, slanted hand, each one folded neatly, placed with a sprig of rosemary or a feather or a drop of wax still warm. He never spoke of them aloud, but one was found years later, tucked inside a hollow in the tower wall. The river forgets the name of the bridge. The owl blinks once and the crown grows cold. A prince will sleep in a chamber of stone where footsteps echo, but none return. He began to avoid the chapel. He said the candlelight flickered the wrong way. He said the echo in the apse was too quick, as though the words hurried to leave. One day, a monk found him kneeling, not in prayer, but simply kneeling. His eyes closed, lips parted. When the monk spoke his name, Edward opened his eyes and said, "There's someone in the crypt who keeps calling me by mine." After that, he no longer went to the lower levels. The omens began to reach the staff. A chambermaid found a hairbrush filled with black feathers instead of hair. A page boy stepped into the hall outside Edward's room and swore he heard laughter. His own voice echoed back at him in perfect pitch. Candles sputtered when he walked past. Paintings grew colder near his presence. And once, just once, someone claimed they saw his shadow move when he did not. And yet through all of this, Edward remained calm. He did not scream. He did not weep. He watched. He listened. He folded the scrolls carefully. He watched the sky at twilight and said, "It's almost time." For what? I do not know, but it is near. It was as if he understood something the rest of them had not yet realized. As if he walked with one foot in the waking world and the other in a place just beneath it, where bells rang without sound and doors waited with warm handles and birds turned above a tower that had forgotten how to let people leave. Gossip among servants or monks. Were there whispers of a curse? Was the royal haunted by visions or voices? It is in the quiet that rumors grow best, and the tower, cold, echoing, full of corners, was never short of quiet. Within its walls, servants did not shout. They murmured. Courtiers treaded softly, as though their footsteps might wake something old. And when they passed the chamber of young King Edward, their eyes would flick toward the door, but never linger. At first, the gossip was simple, that the boy had grown solemn since his father's death, that grief had aged him, that the crown had fallen too early onto too narrow shoulders. But then came stranger words, spoken behind gloved hands, spoken by candlelight, spoken after confirming the door was closed. They said Edward did not eat for days, that he paced through the night, his lips moving but no sound emerging, that he stood before tapestries and asked them questions. A washerwoman swore she found a sheet beneath the royal bed covered in strange markings, not ink but soot or ash arranged in perfect spirals. She burned it, but afterward she claimed her hands were cold for 3 days, even in sunlight. A monk reported that Edward's chamber door sometimes opened before he knocked, though he'd heard no footsteps, no voices from within. Another said that when he approached the young king with holy water and a blessing, Edward had smiled and stepped back. "It's not for me," he'd said. "Not yet." The cooks refused to deliver meals to his rooms, not out of fear of the boy, but of the air that clung to the corridor outside his chamber. They said it felt too still, too expectant, like something was waiting just behind the door. One page boy disappeared for an afternoon after delivering a scroll to the prince. He was found sitting in the west stairwell, unmoving, eyes wide and glassy. When asked what he'd seen, he whispered, "A woman, behind the prince. She had no feet, and her veil was made of ash." He never spoke again. There were stories that the bells in the chapel rang once, all on their own, at the hour of dusk, that birds refused to land near the tower windows, that a voice, soft, childlike, could sometimes be heard reciting scripture in a language no one recognized. The priest said nothing, the guards said less, but the servants kept speaking. They said a curse had been spoken over the crown, that when Edward was an infant, a midwife saw a shadow pass over his crib and refused to touch the child again, that 3 kings had been buried in the wrong order, and the boy had inherited their unrest. Some believed he was haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. Not his own, but the memories of others, of the princes who had never ruled, of the kings who were crowned in sorrow and buried in secret. Even Richard, his brother, had begun to draw away from him. The 2 boys once shared laughter, games, the clatter of carved wooden soldiers. But now Richard kept to the southern tower. He slept more. He avoided mirrors. One nurse said she saw them together only once in the final days, standing at opposite ends of a hallway, staring at one another, saying nothing. And in the end, the whispers grew bold enough to reach the ears of those who should have silenced them, but no punishment came. Only more silence, more curtains drawn, more doors closed, and all the while in the tallest tower, the boy king continued his quiet descent. Not into madness, not into illness, not into sleep, but into something slower, colder, like a candle burning not out but inward. The change came slowly, like mist curling in from the river. No sudden fever, no cough echoing through the halls, just quiet things, subtle things, noticed only by those who watched in silence. At first, it was the candles. Edward began extinguishing them one by one, even in the middle of his reading, until the room was lit by only a single flame. He said too much light made the shadows move in the wrong direction. He said the corners were listening. He said the flame should burn alone. Then his hands began to tremble. Not always. Only when he reached for certain objects, mirrors, bells, letters sealed in red wax. He would pull his hand back as if touched by something cold. Once he reached for a bowl of water and stared into it for so long that a servant thought he'd fallen asleep standing. When touched gently on the shoulder, Edward whispered, "I saw my reflection blink after I did." He spoke less and less as the days passed. What had once been soft responses became nods, then distant gazes, then silence. And when he did speak, his words were not always rooted in the present. He would mention rooms that didn't exist. He would ask after courtiers who had died years before. He once turned to his nurse and said in perfect clarity, "Tell my father I waited," but the crown was too heavy. His movements slowed. He began walking in circles around his chamber, always in threes, 3 clockwise turns, then 3 in the other direction. Then he would sit, not blinking, as if waiting for the room to move instead of him. He no longer ate with utensils. Instead, he pulled his food apart, delicately with his fingers, placing pieces into his mouth like offerings to a shrine. He said metal had begun to taste like ink. When his brother Richard tried to visit, Edward refused to open the door. The boy waited for nearly an hour outside, holding a carved toy soldier, their favorite from childhood. Eventually, the door creaked open just slightly, and Edward said without looking, "You should keep him. He belongs to the living." He no longer slept in his bed. Each night, he made a small nest of blankets in the corner of the room, far from windows, far from mirrors. He said the bed listened. He said it dreamed when he didn't. His breathing became uneven, not labored, not panic, just off, as though he inhaled memories and exhaled silence, as though his body followed a rhythm older than his heartbeat. One evening, a physician was summoned. The old man asked the usual questions, examined Edward's eyes, checked his pulse, and then left the room without speaking. To the chamberlain, he simply said, "He is not ill in body. He is slipping through something." His skin began to grow cold. Not clammy, not pale. Just cold, like the stone walls he so often leaned against, as if the warmth was being drawn inward, held tightly, protected. A priest attempted to anoint him, but the oil would not absorb into Edward's skin. It beaded, as if the boy were made of something other than flesh. The priest whispered a prayer and left, crossing himself 3 times. And yet, Edward did not seem frightened. Not truly. He smiled sometimes when he was alone. He spoke to shadows as if they were old friends. He read from blank pages and nodded, satisfied. His illness was not one of pain. It was an unweaving, a slow undoing of the thread that held him in place. He was fading, but not vanishing. He was softening, but not breaking. Those who watched him closely said it was like watching a painting sink slowly into water. Still beautiful, still present, but no longer sharp, no longer here. And so they stopped calling it an illness. There was no name for what had come over the boy, only silence and the soft, steady dimming of a king who was never crowned and perhaps never meant to be. At first, the court said nothing. To speak aloud of the prince's condition felt dangerous, as though naming it would bring it closer, make it real. So the nobles kept their expressions still. They bowed, nodded, smiled with cold politeness, and watched. But behind the stillness, they whispered. In quiet corners of the tower, behind velvet curtains and carved oak doors, the murmurs grew louder. He barely speaks. He walks like a ghost. I heard he doesn't eat. I heard he doesn't breathe. Letters were sent, carefully worded, sealed with wax that cracked in the cold. Messages to healers from the western abbeys, to scholars in hidden libraries, to physicians with more experience in death than life. And one by one, they came. The monk from Glastonbury arrived first. He wore robes so tattered they whispered with every step, and he carried a single candle in a silver holder. He sat with Edward for 2 hours and left without a word. That night, every candle in the royal wing burned low, no matter how freshly trimmed. A woman from the north was summoned next. Known for her cures of the mind, she laid herbs beneath Edward's pillow, hung sprigs of juniper and sage near the windows. He watched her with calm eyes and said, "You are kind, but it's not me that needs healing. It's the hours." An apothecary from Kent brought tinctures, roots, and tonics. Edward drank none of them. He said they tasted of metal and memory. The court chaplain read psalms at his door. Edward listened quietly and then asked, "Do the angels remember those who were never crowned?" The nobles began avoiding his wing of the tower. The chamberlain took to announcing news from a distance, standing halfway down the hall with his voice raised just enough to be heard, but not enough to echo. He claimed it was to avoid disturbing the boy's rest. But his eyes told a different story, one of unease, of something felt but not understood. A few of the more devout lords pushed for a full exorcism. The archbishop declined. "This is not a possession," he said. "This is a departure." The Queen Mother Elizabeth was not permitted regular access. She asked after her son often, her voice measured, her hands gloved tighter with each passing day. When finally granted a short audience, she returned weeping quietly, her veil damp. She would not speak of what was said between them. The younger prince, Richard, was kept close, but separate. He asked questions no one would answer. He left gifts outside his brother's door. A book, a handkerchief, a carved bird with painted wings. Each morning, they were found untouched, though someone had moved them slightly, as if examined in silence. The guards rotated more frequently now, not for protection, but because none of them wished to stay long near the boy's door. One swore he saw candlelight flickering beneath the threshold, even when no candles had been lit. Another claimed to hear two voices speaking inside when Edward had been left alone. One said the floor beneath the room had grown colder, as if frost crept up from the stone, even in midsummer. And yet, no one dared remove him. He was still the king, in name. Still of royal blood, still clothed in silence and prophecy. Some believed he would recover. Others feared he never truly existed at all. The court tried to continue. Dinners were held, scrolls were signed, guards changed shifts, and lords recited oaths. But the tower itself knew. The air had shifted, time moved differently, and the child king behind the locked door was not fading. He was becoming something else. Something the court could not name, and did not dare try. In time, even the servants stopped knocking. Edward's world had shrunk to a few shadowed rooms at the top of the tower. The light grew dimmer each day, not because the sun had faded, but because he no longer permitted the curtains to be opened. Heavy drapes of wine-colored velvet were pulled tight and pinned in place, muting the morning and sealing away the sky. He no longer spoke. Not to his attendants, not to the guards, not even to his brother, whose soft footsteps occasionally stopped at the threshold, paused in quiet hope, and then retreated. The boy moved like dusk, slow, smooth, almost imperceptible. He glided from chair to wall, from wall to window, leaving no trail behind. Once, a maid entered the chamber while he was asleep. When she glanced down, she saw a faint outline of his body pressed into the cold stone floor, not the bed. He had curled up like a cat, as if seeking the embrace of the building itself. He began to walk barefoot through the halls. No one knew when the shoes were removed, or where he had placed them. He padded softly across ancient flags, the chill of the stone never seeming to touch him. His toes were pale, his movements quiet, like those of a ghost that had not yet realized it had passed. Mirrors were all removed, at his request. He claimed their glass grew warm when he stood near, and that they whispered names he didn't recognize. Even the polished silver plates were taken away, too reflective, too alive. One day, the tapestries in his room were pulled down. He had stood before them in silence for hours, head tilted as though listening for something beneath the fabric. Then he ordered them removed. "The stories they tell are not mine," he said softly. The smell of his room changed. It was no longer the warm scent of beeswax and clean linen. Now it smelled of old paper, of dried herbs, and something colder, like the scent of untouched rooms, or unopened books, or long-forgotten graves. He no longer ate at regular hours. Instead, he would pick at food left for him on low trays, berries, nuts, thin slices of bread, leaving half of it untouched, arranged in quiet patterns on the plate. Once, a slice of apple was found carved with a single word, soon. The fire was left unlit, even in the evenings, even in winter. Blankets were draped across the hearth, extinguishing its warmth. He claims spoke too loudly. When he slept, if he slept, it was in strange places, underneath the writing desk, folded behind a curtain, curled against the stone wall like ivy reaching for forgotten sun. Some days, he wore his coronation robe over his nightclothes. Other days, he refused all garments except for a thin tunic and a single woolen sleeve, which he wore draped over his shoulder like a memory he could not place. He stopped responding to his name. Call him once, silence. Call him twice, he would blink slowly. Call him 3 times, and he would murmur, "That name was never mine. It was borrowed, like everything else." He no longer read aloud, but the books near his bed changed each night. Sometimes they would be found stacked in towers, 5 tall, 5 wide, like gates. Other times opened and splayed across the floor in a spiral. Once, an entire volume had been written in ink too pale to read, the handwriting too small to decipher. No one touched them again. The guards posted outside his door were replaced hourly, not because of danger, but because none could bear the weight of the silence inside. They said the stillness had a sound, a hum, not like bees or wind, but like something deeper, something underneath. Even the crows, once bold around the tower, began circling wider paths. Their calls no longer echoed near his windows. And inside those rooms, the boy who had once dreamed of kingship became something else. Not mad, not dying, just fading. Fading from voice, from shape, from time. One maid claimed that on her final visit, she looked in and saw only his outline, a faint impression in dust and velvet, like the memory of someone who had sat too long in the same chair. Another claimed she met his eyes and found only stillness, like looking into deep water on a moonless night. He had not been taken. He had not run. He had simply gone somewhere else, a place behind the stones, beneath the silence, beyond the reach of titles and names. And so the tower grew quieter, and the world outside continued. And within the stone embrace of that ancient fortress, the boy who once wore a crown drifted further into stillness and waited. Long before Edward was born, long before the war between roses, there had been whispers. In the abbeys, among the dust-covered manuscripts, in ruined chapels where ivy swallowed altars, in the dreams of monks who spoke in tongues they didn't understand. The prophecies were never loud. They came like drafts through closed windows, like the faint sound of a forgotten bell, like water dripping from somewhere it should not. The first scroll was found decades before Edward's birth, discovered beneath the foundation stones of a monastery during repairs after a storm. The parchment was old, the ink faded, but the words still legible. 2 sons born beneath the moon, one crowned, one silent. The elder shall vanish beneath the tower sky. He shall not die, he shall not reign, he shall pass between the hours. The monks who found it sealed it again, tucked it beneath the floor, and said nothing. But later, years later, another piece appeared. In the archives of a cathedral, a carved psalter bore an odd marginal note, scratched not in Latin, but in a half-forgotten dialect of Middle English. It read, "The one who walks in threes shall never take his throne." And beside it, crudely drawn, was the figure of a child in royal robes, standing in front of a door with no handle. In a monastery near the Welsh border, a hermit once told of a dream. He said he stood before a gray tower under a moon that did not move. Inside, a boy sat in a chair of stone, holding a crown in his lap, but he would not wear it. Instead, he looked at the hermit and said, "This is not the time for kings. This is the time for remembering." The hermit carved those words into a tree. The tree was later struck by lightning and split in 2. No sap ran from the wound, only ash. Back in London, in the Royal Library, a clerk sorting ancient letters stumbled upon a scrap of vellum tucked between the pages of a volume on court etiquette. The ink shimmered strangely, and the words pulsed faintly when held near fire. "The 5th shall follow the 4th, but not walk the same path. He shall live in shadow, reign in name only. The walls shall hold him, but time shall lose him. The crown will forget." The clerk did not report his discovery. He simply closed the book and left the library. No one saw him again. Among the court's spiritual advisors, there were quiet conversations about Edward's birth. He had been born during a solar flare, unusual, unnoticed by most, but marked in a Star Watcher's journal in Venice. The entry read only, "A child born in shadowlight. Do not place gold upon his brow." A French mystic sent a letter, sealed in black wax, to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Its contents were never made public, but the Archbishop burned it without reading aloud and refused to speak of it afterward. He was said to have lost sleep for weeks. Even within the tower itself, the stones seemed to remember. In one unused chamber, a low, vaulted room behind a rusted gate, a monk claimed to find a carving etched in the wall, a crown surrounded by falling feathers. Beneath it, in tiny script, "The white owl shall fly once, then silence." No one could explain the origin. No mason recalled the mark. The chamber was locked thereafter, and still, Edward never asked, never mentioned the old prophecies. But sometimes when the wind pressed against the narrow windows, he would rise from his chair and whisper to the stones, "They said I would not reign. They said I would not die. They did not say I would vanish." But I suppose that was always understood. Whether he believed the prophecies or became them, no one can say. But the omens were there, like distant thunder in a clear sky, ignored, buried, now remembered as faint as breath on glass. Time in the tower began to behave differently. Not suddenly, not like the strike of a bell, but slowly, like frost creeping along the edge of a window pane. One moment followed the next, but something in the rhythm shifted. Hours seemed longer. Days folded into one another like pages left blank. The servants noticed it first. They would begin their duties, as always, and glance up to find the sun hadn't moved. The morning shadows stretched the same way at midday. Candles lasted longer than they should. Bread left to rise never fully did. Clocks began to stall. Not in dramatic fashion, no sudden stops or shattered gears. They ticked gently, dutifully, and then simply paused. A second suspended. A chime that never came. Even the great bell in the chapel tower rang off beat, once late, once early, once not at all. The birds, once restless over the battlements, grew still. The crows ceased circling. The doves no longer gathered at the garden well. Only a single owl remained, perched atop a gargoyle above the eastern turret, its white feathers unmoving even in the wind. Inside the palace, speech became rare. The courtiers spoke softly, if they spoke at all. Their words were clipped, vague, stripped of certainty. What time is it? Has anyone seen the sun today? Was that yesterday or the day before? Servants began leaving tasks half finished. Laundry hung without ever drying. Books lay open on window seats. Pages never turned. A goblet of wine remained untouched for days, yet the level of liquid never seemed to change. Even laughter seemed to echo differently, stretched thinner, as if the walls took longer to return the sound. In the kitchens, the hearth fires smoldered without fully catching. No matter how much wood was stacked, the flames remained small, pale, reluctant. Stews cooked slowly, as if the ingredients resisted change. One maid swore she fell asleep during prayers and dreamt she had aged 20 years. When she woke, her hands ached as if she had lived that time. Guards stood their watches but grew unsure of when their shifts began or ended. One claimed he saw a figure walking the same hallway 3 times in 1 hour. Another said he passed the same door 4 times without taking a turn. It was as if the tower itself held its breath, not in fear, but in reverence, as if it sensed something ancient had returned, or perhaps had never left. The prince's rooms were untouched. No one entered, no one knocked, but all knew he was still there, still waiting. The Queen Mother sent word less often. Her letters arrived with fewer lines, and finally, not at all. Visitors from outside the city gates were turned away with gentle excuses. The young king is resting, the council is in session, the hour is not right, but there was no council, no messages, no decisions. There was only quiet. Even the river slowed. The Thames, once filled with barges and gentle ripples, became glass-like. Fishermen complained their nets caught nothing. One claimed the water had grown too heavy, too deep, as though it carried something beneath it that was not meant to be seen. And so, the palace slept. A suspended world, a place untethered, a time unmeasured. The tower remained, gray and tall, its windows watching. The people inside moved slower, the birds sang less, the stones remembered more. And at the center of it all, behind shuttered windows and candle-stained walls, a boy sat perfectly still, neither dead nor alive, neither prince nor prisoner, a soul caught between seconds, a kingdom suspended. No announcement was made, no decree issued, but all within the tower felt it, the shift. Something had changed, not in sound, not in light, but in the rhythm of the walls themselves, as if the stones knew what the heart had not yet spoken. Edward no longer moved from his chamber. He remained curled beneath a faded woolen shawl in the far corner of the room, where the firelight once reached, but now no longer bothered. His breath was soft, shallow, and slow, so slow at times that the nursemaid who checked on him held her own breath just to hear it. He would not eat. He would not speak. He would not look toward the window. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on a single patch of wall, blank stone, worn smooth with age. When asked gently what he saw, he whispered, "A gate, just a little longer." He spoke more often now, but never to anyone in the room. He murmured names that puzzled the attendants. George, Anne, Tomlin the bellboy, Mother, I left my shoes. He was not always awake when he said them. Sometimes the words floated from his mouth like breath itself, formless, effortless, carried on the hush of dreams. Once he began reciting a lullaby from his childhood. The melody was uneven, slow, and sad. No one joined him. No one dared. A candle at his bedside flickered wildly without wind. When the physician entered to check his pulse, Edward opened his eyes just long enough to say, "Don't wake them," and closed them again. He no longer flinched from mirrors. There were none left. But he began to turn his face away from his own reflection in the water bowl. When the bowl was removed, he smiled faintly and said, "Now they can rest too." His final meal was left untouched. A small plate of soft fruit, warm bread, and a glass of watered wine. The wine evaporated over time. The bread grew hard. The fruit shriveled. The plate remained beside him until long after. No one could say exactly when the boy fell fully asleep. One day, he simply stopped opening his eyes. He breathed. He murmured. He dreamed. His brother Richard was brought once more. He stood by Edward's side for a long while, too young to understand, too old not to feel. He held the old carved wooden soldier between his hands and whispered, "You can have him back now if you want." Edward did not move, but a tear slid down his cheek. Later, the nursemaid said it was the only sign he gave in those final days. One tear. No sound. No breath stirred to follow. That night, the sky over London was clear. The owl atop the turret lifted its wings and flew away, vanishing into the stars. The candle beside Edward's bed burned down to nothing. The wick gave no smoke, no scent of wax, just a curl of darkness where light had once been. He did not cry out. He did not sigh. He did not reach. The silence came softly, like a blanket pulled over the last hour. No one saw it, but all felt it. The final breath. The last flicker. The boy asleep entirely now, beyond voices, beyond shadows, beyond time. And in the chamber where he had once walked in threes, whispered to stone, and waited for a door no one else could see, only stillness remained. They did not ring the bells. Not at first. Not when the silence came. Not when the nurses folded their hands and lowered their eyes. Not when the physician closed his ledger without a word. For a time, the tower simply held its breath. Then, sometime near dawn, long after the candles had burned out and the fire had cooled to gray ash, the chapel bell tolled once. Not a morning bell, just one long, uncertain note, like a question without an answer. The rituals began without proclamation. No couriers were dispatched. No procession was arranged. But the servants washed the stone floors. The windows were open just for a moment to let the cold morning air move through the chamber where Edward had lain. His body was prepared with care, though not ceremony. The old nurse, who had once held him as an infant, brushed his hair smooth and straight. She folded his hands around a scrap of parchment no one read, and she whispered something into his ear before stepping back and crossing herself, tears quietly falling into the folds of her apron. He was dressed in white, not in a king's robes, not in velvet or gold, but in a simple tunic of soft linen, embroidered faintly with stars. He was placed in a plain wooden coffin, light in color, smooth, unmarked. The priests chanted low, not the full rites, just fragments, a psalm here, a hymn there, as if even the liturgy had forgotten what was required for a king who had never been crowned. There was no public mourning. The tower gates remained closed. The streets of London bustled on, unaware. A few nobles donned black, but not for long. The court turned its eyes elsewhere. Only a few gathered for the procession, such as it was. 2 monks led the way with dim lanterns. Behind them, the coffin. Then a servant bearing a folded banner, blank, the colors never stitched. And finally a young boy, Richard, walking alone, clutching the old wooden soldier. The chapel beneath the tower had been cleared, a place not used for many years, damp, shadowed, smelling of stone and oil. Here the coffin was lowered into the crypt. No fanfare, no marble, no inscription. A single candle was lit above the stone where he lay. It burned low. It flickered, and then it went out. Later, some said they saw a white feather drift through the air and settle on the chapel floor. No birds had entered. The door was sealed, the key turned once, then twice, then left in place, and that was the end. No statue was raised, no feast was held, no great wailing or procession of grief. It was as if Edward had never ruled, as if he had never been meant to. He was not mourned as a monarch, nor remembered as a prince. He became a whisper, a faint memory, a boy lost in time. And above him, the tower stood, silent, still, its walls holding the weight of things never spoken and the dreams of a king who never truly lived. The rooms were never used again. After Edward was laid to rest, the tower closed its shutters more tightly. His chamber door was locked, not with ceremony, but with quiet, deliberate finality. The key was placed in an iron chest in the chapel and never spoken of again. But the room remained. Nothing was moved, nothing disturbed. The books still sat in their quiet spiral on the floor. The candle stub lay curled in its dish, the wax cracked but uncleaned. The woolen shawl, folded once and then again, sat on the edge of the stone bench where he had last rested. Dust began to settle. First on the windowsills, where the cold air no longer touched. Then on the desk, where no new scrolls would ever be read. Then in the creases of the stone floor, where the boy had walked barefoot in gentle, circling steps. His bed remained untouched. The mattress never warmed again. No new sheets were brought. The servants passed by without glancing through the door. His crown, if it can be called that, was never placed upon his head. It sat, still, wrapped in velvet, in a chest at the far end of the chamber. When someone finally opened it, they found the cloth untouched, but the gold duller than before. And within the folds of silk, a small slip of paper. No words, just a drawing. A staircase, descending into stars. The portraits in the gallery faded faster than the others. Not in dramatic ways, no torn canvas or mold. Just quiet fading. The paint seemed to blur, the eyes growing less distinct with each season. Soon, even the court painter could not say which one was Edward's. The wooden soldier his brother had left behind was discovered years later beneath a floorboard. One leg missing, one arm painted silver, and on its chest, carved faintly with a pin, "Wait for me." In a drawer beside the window, a bundle of herbs was found, long dried and crumbling to touch. Rosemary, lavender, and a single white feather bound in twine. No note. No explanation. A priest claimed he once heard singing from the sealed room. A child's voice, thin, reedy, like a lullaby, hummed without words. When he returned the next day, the air in the hallway was cold enough to fog his breath. No one tried to reopen the rooms again. The tower simply shifted its weight around them, allowing those chambers to fade quietly from the map. Visitors were told the wing was under repair. Guards were posted less frequently nearby. Dust gathered thicker each year. And beyond the tower, the world forgot. Edward's name appeared in fewer chronicles. His face, rarely drawn, became a question mark in royal lineage. Was he ever truly crowned? Did he rule? Did he die? Did he vanish? The court moved on. A new ruler rose. The throne stood beneath new robes. The crown found another head. But somewhere behind the walls of the tower, something remained. A hush. A memory. The soft shape of a boy's breath, long gone, but not quite erased. And the faintest imprint on the stone floor, where someone once knelt, waiting for a door that never opened. And so the boy is gone. Not buried in marble, not remembered in ballad, but folded into the silence of stone where time moves slower, and memory learns to sleep. No trumpet marked his passing. No crowds wept in the streets. But high within the tower, where the fog moves like breath across the old gray walls, something still listens, still remembers. A crown never worn, a throne never claimed, a name whispered once more and then no more at all. The world outside has long since turned its gaze. New kings, new wars, new stories to tell. But within the hush of ancient corridors, his steps still echo faintly, barefoot, careful, quiet. They say the chamber remains sealed, the dust undisturbed, the candle long cold. But sometimes, only sometimes, when the moon is high and the wind moves just right through the broken arrow slits, a soft breath can be heard, like a sigh or a word never spoken. He was never crowned, he never ruled. And yet, in some gentle way, he remains. In dreams, in silence, in the hollow stillness where forgotten things wait to be remembered. Tonight, we close the book once more. Let the candles go dim. Let the tower fall quiet. Let the river keep its secrets. And as the stars blink softly above the chapel roof, a single white feather drifts downward unseen and rests upon the stones. Edward sleeps, the kingdom rests, and beneath the chapel moonlight, the world forgets, and peace returns.